In a nutshell, the Basel Convention, its scope is hazardous waste and what is denominated other waste. Other waste actually are household wastes. So when you combine household waste with what may be hazardous for human health or the environment, you can imagine that the scope is really huge. There are the following pillars to the convention, and they are not translated in the same type of obligations under the convention. So as a matter of principle, we have this life cycle approach to waste. So we have some obligations towards minimizing the waste generation, obligations towards ensuring the environmentally sound management of wastes. But both these are actually soft law commitments. So they're not really the core of the treaty, but they're there. And then the third pillar is really the core of the treaty. That's where you'll have really hard law commitments, very specific obligations that parties have to implement and comply with. And that's the control of transboundary movements of waste. There are conditions for such movements to take place, so they're allowed if those conditions are met. For example, you're not allowed to export to non-party, or you're not allowed to export if you have within your country the facilities to manage the waste. So some conditions for trade to take place, but if those conditions are met, then normally waste can move across borders, but you have to then follow this prior informed consent procedure, which is a very detailed procedure with 4 stages. And on paper, it's very detailed and very clear what has to be done. Of course, in practice, it's more complicated. But at least the text of the convention is very thorough, I would say, in detailing how each movement should take place, because for each movement of waste that this procedure has to be followed. So the third bullet is really the core of the obligations for parties when it comes to achieving the environmental objective, right? And then the fourth pillar of the convention is that it's related to the third one, is that parties have an obligation to prevent and combat illegal traffic. So there's, again, here a provision that defines illegal traffic, and also a provision that clarifies the consequences of illegal traffic. So it's quite detailed. You don't have many MEAs that go so far in clarifying, first of all, what illegal trade is, and then what are the consequences at the international level. So a set of soft law commitments and of hard law commitments when it comes to the environmental obligations, I would say. But in addition to that, I've highlighted other obligations that can be very strict, but that are more to make sure that the regime is working, that information is shared. For example, that there's information on how parties are doing to implement and whether the objective of the convention is achieved. So I've put here an obligation of reporting on an annual basis, an obligation to notify some information to the Secretariat, typically information on country contacts that are designated because they have a role to play, a formal role to play under the convention. So of course everybody has to know among the parties who these entities are so you can interact with them, or so that the Secretariat can interact with them. What's important here, not necessary for the effectiveness of the convention itself, but to understand maybe some elements of its compliance regime, and also to understand differences between the regime that's established under Basel and what's been negotiated now under Stockholm in particular, is that under the Basel Convention there's no financial mechanism, but there are regional centers that have been established there to assist with technical assistance for developing countries and EITs, and also to transfer some technology. And there's also a technical assistance program. So basically the Secretariat can receive voluntary funding to then assist parties to implement the convention. And the last point I'll mention is that there's no express legal basis for compliance. You heard yesterday that Montreal Protocol is the first treaty to have a specific legal basis in Article 8. That was 1987. And although Basel was negotiated at the same time and adopted just after, at the time it was not felt, or I don't know if the things did not communicate, but one thing is sure is that there's no express legal basis. But as we know, it's not because there's not an express legal basis that things cannot be done, especially when the COP has a mandate to establish subsidiary bodies. And that's the legal basis that was used to actually establish this compliance committee under the Basel Convention. So what I wanted to highlight here is really a mix of soft law commitments, some hard law commitments, no financial mechanism, and these are all access to information on what parties are doing. These are all features of a treaty that have to be taken into account to understand how a compliance regime is negotiated, established, so that it makes sense. Compliance doesn't come in a vacuum, right? It has to really be modeled on the content of the treaty.